Hello everybody. So now I will start on the chapter about international migration, and here it's divided on these 5 topics. So we start with definitions and concepts, and then talk about patterns of world immigration over time, and then concentrate in the case of the US immigration to the United States, and also talk about undocumented immigration, also with a focus on the US, and talk about the economic effects of immigration in the country of destination. Again, giving some examples for the US as well. So I will start now on the major concepts related to international migration. So the first international migration of humans are believed to have occurred about 60,000 years ago. So it has been happening for a long time. International migration is a geographical movement involving a change in residence that crosses the boundaries of 2 or more countries. So people are moving from one country to the other, and that's when we call those people international migrants. International migration has both positive and negative impacts, both on areas of origin and destination. So migration is an interesting demographic component, and it's difficult to analyze migration exactly because it affects both the areas of origin and destination, and it might have positive and or negative effects in both of these areas. And just to be more specific, immigration refers to the movement of people to a new country for the purpose of establishing a permanent residence. So these people are really moving to another country with the purpose of staying there for a long time. An immigrant is a person who crosses an international boundary with the intention to live permanently in a new country. And related to this term, immigration and immigrant, we have emigration. Emigration refers to the permanent departure of people from a country. An emigrant is a person who moves away from a country with the intention of establishing a permanent residence elsewhere. So let's talk about an international migration flow that we hear a lot about it, of people moving from Mexico to the United States. If I'm doing an analysis from the point of view of Mexico, of people moving out of Mexico and coming to the United States, I'm doing analysis of immigration. I'm looking how people leaving, getting out of Mexico, going to the US might affect the area of origin, which is Mexico. And I want to know if Mexico is losing a lot of labor because of a lot of these immigrants, they are in labor ages. I want to know if that has a negative effect on Mexico. Or maybe these immigrants come to the US and afterwards they send money back to Mexico. So they send remittances to Mexico, and then there is a positive effect to Mexico because of this immigration process. Or I can do another analysis in the point of view of the US. I want to know if these immigrants that come from Mexico to the US, if they're competing for jobs with US-born people. Maybe, let's say, most of the immigrants from Mexico, they are low-skilled immigrants. I want to know if these low-skilled immigrants are competing for jobs with low-skilled US-born people, and that might affect negatively the earnings of the US-born population. Or maybe there are several jobs available here in the US that are not being fulfilled by the US-born population, so this immigration flow is good because it gives a supply of labor to the demand that the American economy has. So I can see in this analysis here both positive and negative. I can evaluate whether immigration to the US from Mexico has positive and negative effects to the American society, and I can also analyze if immigration has positive or negative effects to the Mexican society. So it depends much more on the point of view that I'm doing the analysis. So in every international migration, a migrant is simultaneously an immigrant and an emigrant. So exactly what I mentioned before about the migration from Mexico to the US, if I'm analyzing, focusing on the effects in the area of origin, I'm talking more about immigrants. And if I'm focusing more on the effects in the area of destination, I'm talking more about immigrants. In long-term immigration, the residence establishment in the destination country is usually at least 1 year. So usually we use this term that someone is a long-term immigrant if that person lives in the country of destination for at least 1 year. And long-term immigrants comprised around 3.2% of the world's population in 2013. And in recent decades, the number of long-term immigrants has increased dramatically. So from 75 million in 1964 to 120 million in 1990, 190 million in 2006, and then 232 million in 2013. And one of the reasons that long-term immigrants increased dramatically between 2006 and 2013, one of the reasons of that is exactly the Syrian Civil War, which started in 2011, and a lot of Syrians started to move to neighboring countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and North Iraq. So then you have a really increase on the number of long-term immigrants. But the case of the Syrian Civil War is just one example. There are several other flows of immigration and emigration between countries in the world that made these total numbers increase a lot in these recent years. A related topic to it, to international migration, is related to return migration, which is also known as remigration. Remigration refers to the return of international migrants back to their countries of origin. So a remigrant is an international migrant who returns back to re-establish permanent residence in his/her original country of residence. So let's say that we have Latin Americans that moved to the US during their labor ages, and then they work here in the US for a while, and after several decades working here, they decide to go back to their country of origin in Latin America. So they are considered return migrants. And those return migrants, they can be either voluntary or involuntarily. The voluntary, they just decide to go back to their home country, maybe because they got older, they retired in the US, and they just want to live in their older ages in their country of origin, or maybe it's an involuntary return migration, people being deported from the US to Latin America because they are undocumented in the US, and the American government deport those migrants. And in that case, they are still like a return migration because they're going back to their country of origin, but it's not voluntarily because it's a deportation process. And within this discussion, it's important to talk about tourists. Tourists and visitors, they are different from international migrants. Their visits to another country is usually short-term. Their visits do not involve establishing permanent residence in the destination country. But you could say, oh, but some people come to the US with tourist visa, and they're supposed to stay here only for 3 or 6 months, depending on how they get the stamp in their passport when they enter, but they overstay their visas. But in that case, they stop being tourists and then they become undocumented immigrants in the US. But tourists are those who come to the US, stayed here for few months, 3-6 months, and then they go back to their home country, to their country of origin, or to the country where they were living before. So those are tourists or visitors, and they are not considered international migrants because they are just staying here for a short term. And among immigrant groups, we can divide them in these 4 major groups. So we have refugee and asylee is someone who involuntarily emigrates from his/her native country to a new country due to persecution, violence, or deprivation. And usually they move to a neighboring country. So this is exactly the example that I gave before about Syrians. Because of the Syrian civil war that's going on right now, a lot of people are moving to neighboring countries, like I said, such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and they are refugees in those countries where they are moving to. And we also have those migrants from a former colony. So those are those who move from a decolonized country to its former imperial country seeking better living conditions. So that happens a lot of people, Africans who live in African countries that were former colonies of Western European countries, and then because these ties, these historical ties that they have, some of these people, some of these African population, they become migrants and they move into Western European countries that they were, that these African countries were their former colony. An economic migrant is someone who voluntarily moves to live in a destination country for economic reasons. And this is, for example, the case of Latin Americans coming to the US, or more specifically, of Mexicans coming to the US. And more recently, we have been hearing more in the media immigrants to the US from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, because they are looking for better socioeconomic conditions and better life. And in that case, in some cases in these countries, they are actually refugees because they are living violence and deprivation in those northern Central American countries, so they're moving to the US. So in that case, more recently from Latin America to the US, you have both economic migrants and also refugees, because in some of these people moving from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, they're applying for the refugee status exactly because of facing violence in their home country. But those that move here mostly to look for better economic conditions, they are known as economic migrants. And in this case, the example of Mexicans come to the US, it's really clear. And an ethnic privileged migrant is someone who is a descendant of a nation's ethnic core group living outside of the mother countries for generations. So we have a lot of Western European migrants, for example, living in Latin America, living in Brazil, living in Argentina, and those are usually more ethnic privileged migrants. When they move to these destination countries, they are moving there not because they necessarily were facing economic issues in their country of origin or violence in their country of origin, but because they see they have ties with previous immigrants from their countries that moved to these destination areas, and they decide to move there as well. Whenever we talk about international migration, it's important for us to understand the definition of generations. When we say that someone is a first-generation immigrant, those are people that are born in another country, so they are foreign-born, so they are born in another country, but they live somewhere else. So all the people who live in the United States but were born in another country, they are first-generation immigrants because they were not born in the US. But out of these first-generation immigrants, it's also interesting to differentiate of the 1.5th generation. That's a distinction for those who came as children. So maybe there are children who arrived, for example, giving the same example for the US, those who arrived to the US up to the age of 12, so they arrived to the US as children, maybe they came here, so they were born somewhere else, they were born in another country, so technically they are first generation, but because they arrived in the US in such an early age as children, they will go to school in the US, they will learn the English language, like since they are children, they will have many more chances to integrate quicker to the American society than their parents. So they're called like the 1.5 generation because although they were born in another country, they came to the US so in such early age that they will integrate much faster to the society where they're moving to. And I'm talking here about the US, but that's just an example. This term generations, we can think about it, we can subdivide immigrants and all these different generations for any country of destination. And if you want to be even more specific, we can break down this 1.5th generation into 1.25th generation, those who came from ages 13 to 18, 1.5th generation, those who came from ages 6 to 12, and 1.75th generation, those who came from infancy to age 5. Because those who arrived so early in their lives to the US, although their parents were born in another country, but they came so young to the country of destination that they will have many more chances to integrate really quickly to the country in terms of language, culture, nutrition, everything, that they are really close to be a second generation. But technically they are not. And it's just whether we subdivide them in 1.25th, 1.5th, and 1.75th, it depends on whether we have this information about the age that they arrive in the country of destination, and also whether we have enough people that can be classified within the subgroups. Because if our sample it's really small and we don't have enough people that can be counted in these subgroups, we usually just classify them as 1.5th generation. And the second generation are those that are born in the US, they're US born, but their parents were born in another country. So they're US born children of immigrants. Their parents are immigrants. They are born in another country, but they were born in the US. And again, you can subdivide this group by having the second generation as those that they don't have any US born parents. They don't have any parent that was born in the US. Both of their parents were born in another country. They were born in the US, but their parents were both born outside, so they are second generation. But you can have people like children that are born in the US, but only one parent was born in the US and another one was born outside of the US. So those are 2.5th generation. And these guys here are a little closer to the third generation because one of their parents was born here in the US and only one was born outside. Again, whether we can subdivide by second and 2.5th generation, in this case here, we have to know information about their parents, the place of birth of their parents. If we know the place of birth of the mother and of the father, then we can know if like one of them was born in the US and the other one was born outside. But some studies, exactly because we don't have many people that can be classified in the subcategories, sometimes what you see is that they group them. They can just be classified as 1.5th or as second generation. And I have been doing a research about second generation Nigerian Americans in the US using the current population survey. And the current population survey, the sample size is really small. So we can divide them by first, 1.5th, and second generation, but there are not as many Nigerian Americans living in the US to classify them in all these subgroups. And in that case, we pretty much want to know if those people that move to the US and their children, how their children are doing. In our assumption is that if these immigrants, maybe they were not born in the US, but they came here as children, this 1.5th generation is going to be really similar to the second generation in terms of their possibilities to get good jobs, get good education throughout their lives. So we actually group the 1.5th generation to the second generation. In this example, about this research related to Nigerian Americans in the US. So in that case, we have first generation Nigerian Americans, first generation Nigerians, those who were born in Nigeria and live in the US. And then we group the 1.5th and the second generations by getting those children that were born in the US but their parents are from Nigeria, or those children that were born in Nigeria but they moved here when they were children. They moved here up to the age of 12. So in that case, we group both of them because we have a small sample size. We do have all this refined information here from the current population survey, but since the sample size is small, we group these two categories. And finally, third generation are grandchildren of immigrants. They are U.S. born, and they have two native born parents. So they are born in the U.S. So these are the immigrants that they are born in the U.S. and their parents, they also are born in the U.S. So U.S. born and native born means the same thing in this case here. So these people here are U.S. born, they were born in the U.S., and both of their parents were also born in the U.S. So they are third generation immigrants. And then you can have those that are born in the U.S., their parents are born in the U.S., and their great-grandparents are born in the U.S., and their grandparents are born in the U.S., and so on. So we actually usually group all these people for upper generations in the third plus generation. So in this case here, we have this person was born in the US and their parents also, but then their grandparents could have been born here, the great-grandparents as well, and so on. So usually those people are all grouped into the third plus generation. And these classifications here are really important to understand, and I got them from different studies here. This is an important long report that was funded by the National Academies of Science, and because a lot of people usually use these terms of generations talking about immigrants, but they usually don't explain them well. So it's good for us to understand all these specificities of how we classify people, how we classify immigrants by generations. Douglas Massey is a professor in the University of Princeton, and he's the most well-known demographer that does studies about international migration in the US, and he elaborated some major laws of international migration. We already talked about him in the chapter about theories of migration early in this course, in which he summarizes a series of migration theories that try to explain the reasons why people migrate and the reasons why migration keep happening. And here Dudley Poston, he summarizes some of these major laws of international migration based on studies by Douglas Massey. And Dudley Poston, as you know, is the author of the textbook that we are using for this course. So immigration is a lot easier to start than it is to stop. So once a migration from one country to the other starts, it's really hard to stop it. Actions taken to restrict immigration often have the opposite effect, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in the case of the US, because the fundamental causes of immigration may be outside the control of policymakers. So some policymakers might try to restrict immigration, but that might have the opposite effect. So in the US, for example, in 1986, you have an immigration reform done in the country, but then it increased border security, tried to avoid more immigrants to come from Latin America to the US, but actually that had the opposite effect because it was maybe more difficult for people to enter, but when they entered, they would not go back to Latin America. So they became more permanent immigrants. So the policy that was implemented in the mid-80s had the opposite effect as intended originally. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it in this chapter. Immigrants understand immigration better than politicians and academicians and people in academia because immigrants understand immigration better than policymakers. Immigrants are often able to circumvent policies aimed at stopping them. And that's really, really clear in the case of policies being implemented in the US, in which although some policies, some reforms might be called comprehensive immigration reforms, they actually are not so that comprehensive because they usually have the opposite effect as intended. So exactly because policymakers are not understanding the whole complexity of the reasons of why these immigration flows are happening from these different countries to the US. And again, I'm focusing in the US, but of course, these major laws of international migration, they apply to several different flows in the world between countries. And whenever we are talking about the association between development and migration, it's important to go back to those theories that we discussed before, theories of migration, the kind of like explaining the differences between the structuralist theory and the functionalist theory. So the structuralism is the neo-Marxist and the center-periphery theory that usually criticizes the functionalist theory, which is known as the neoclassical or the push-pull theory. So they kind of like have different views or different explanations of why migration happens. So the functionalist theory assumes that socioeconomic forces tend toward equilibrium through migration. So in the functionalist theory, in the neoclassical theory, you have some push and pull factors that make people move from one place to the other. And then usually one place that have more unemployment will lose migrants to another country that has more employment opportunities. But in the long term, what's going to happen is that area that had more unemployment, because people are leaving, getting out of those countries and going to this other country, they will kind of stabilize the unemployment rates between these two countries. So the country of origin will have less unemployment, and the other one, the country of destination, will have less availability of employment. So it tends towards this equilibrium through migration. In the structuralist theory, it sees a general pattern of disruptions, dislocations, and migrations intrinsic to the capitalist society. So in this theory, the idea is that the capitalist society creates a general pattern of inequality between countries that make some countries be richer than others, and then people will look for better opportunities in other countries. And then it creates all these migration flows from one country to the other. But even though they have different explanations for why migration is happening and what and how migration will stop, if it's because it tends to an equilibrium, or because maybe in the future the capitalist society or some other form of society will have less disruptions. Although these different theories, they have different explanations about why migration happens, they do share some common assumptions. So they do have some assumptions that they agree upon them. So both of them think that more development leads to less immigration. So more developed societies will tend to have less immigrants. So they will tend to lose less people, and they will actually tend to attract more people into their society, into their population. Higher development differences across areas, so spatial disequilibrium, leads to more migration. And just as a way to summarize this in a graph format, this is a way to show this migration transition theory. So countries that have higher levels of development will tend to attract more immigrants to their society. So immigration will tend to increase. So here we're talking about migration rates. And in terms of attracting people, so having immigrants will be higher as the specific countries tend to increase their level of economic development or socio-economic development in general. And countries with low level of development usually have low levels of immigration, because usually these countries are so poor that people don't have the means to move to other countries. So these people will tend to stay in their countries of origin, although their countries of origin have low levels of development. But as these countries start to have a little better economic development, then people will start to have, maybe they are now like a great proportion of these people are more like low middle class, they will start to have higher chances of emigrating. So they become like, then you have more people in the middle class, they will have more chance to emigrate because they now have the means to move to another country and to other countries in which they think they will have better opportunities in their lives. But as those countries start to develop even more, and then the life conditions start to be really good for the population, then the levels of immigration tend to decline, right? So immigration in countries with really low levels of development is low. It increases as development starts to increase, but then afterwards immigration declines as the level of development starts to be really high. And immigration as a whole increases overall as level of development increases. And this is just to give an idea of the overall number of immigrants in different countries. So in 2013, more than 50% of the international migrants in the world resided in just 10 countries. So it's just to show you that just 10 countries here, they had more than 50% of all international migrants in 2013. And the United States had 46 million of the international migrants. They were living in the US, 11 million in Russia, 10 million in Germany, and so on. And this number increased in the US from 2000 to 2013 from 35 to 46 million. In Russia, actually decreased a little bit. And in other countries, we also see some variation. Saudi Arabia increased a lot. The United Arab Emirates, that we already talked during the course, increased a lot, exactly because of job opportunities for male workers going to this country. But overall, what you see is like, first, 50% of all international migrants in 2013 were living just in these 10 countries, but you also see a really huge concentration of international migrants in the US. And this other graph, it's more about net migration. This is to talk about the major origins and destinations of international migrants between 2010 and 2015. So here between 2010 and 2015, the US received 1 million more migrants than lost migrants. So it had 1 million more immigrants than emigrants, because we are talking about net migration. Net migration, when we are talking about international migration, is the number of immigrants minus the number of immigrants. So in the US, between this period here, we had 1 million more immigrants than immigrants in the country, so we have positive net migration. And these numbers here are in thousands, that's why this one here is 1 million. And these other countries here also had more immigrants than immigrants. And these other countries here, they had more people getting out of those countries than getting in. For example, in Syria, exactly in the period when it started the civil war in 2011, in Syria, it lost around this time here, and these are annual numbers. So annual, that's the average, the annual average for this period here. So in Syria, it lost more people than it received. So it had 720,000 more immigrants than immigrants per year between this period. And in the US, it had 1 million more immigrants than immigrants per year between this period. Okay, so here more immigrants than immigrants, and here in Syria more immigrants than immigrants, because people are getting out of Syria. So 720,000 more getting out of Syria than getting in per year between 2010 and 2015. And here we are talking about all these flows, these annual flows going on in these specific time periods. And then in this map, it kind of like summarizes, it gives us an idea of the stock of migration. After like all these different flows that were going on before 2013. In 2013, what's the percent of foreign-born population in each one of these countries? So we're talking about the stock, the overall amount. And the overall amount, of course, can be exemplified in millions, in thousands, or in percent. So in this case here, the countries that are like in red, they have at least 10% of the population are international migrants. The ones in orange have between 1 and 9.9%, and the ones in yellow, less than 1%, have international migrants as their population. So it shows that the US, Canada, some Western European countries, countries in the Middle East as well, Australia, they have high levels of immigration, and then you have this stock of immigrants in 2013 equals to at least 10% of the overall population. So that was the first topic related to this chapter about international migration. So thank you very much.